You know, conversations about homosexuality and religion, they can get so polarized, right? It often feels like everyone is just shouting past each other. But what if the real issue isn't just about reaching different conclusions, but about having completely different starting points? Well, in this explainer, we're going to dig into one particular argument that tries to find answers by looking at the internal logic of the biblical narrative itself. So, that brings us to the big question right up front. Why does it seem like modern debates and the biblical texts are speaking two totally different languages when it comes to sexuality? I mean, our conversations today are so often focused on personal identity, on rights, but the biblical texts, they seem to be coming from somewhere else entirely, rooted in this huge, ancient story.
Okay, let's dive into this. When we talk about sexuality today, the conversation usually kicks off with concepts like personal identity, psychology, and of course, civil rights. But the argument we're exploring here suggests that the biblical framework starts in a totally different universe. It begins with this grand three-act play: creation, rebellion, and restoration. And the core idea is, if you want to understand the biblical take on sexuality, you have to understand this foundational story first.
So let's do just that. Let's start right where the biblical narrative begins, with the blueprint. This first part of the story, laid out in Genesis, is all about the original design for humanity, for the world, for everything.
At the very heart of this is a foundational concept the text calls the image of God. Now, in this way of thinking, human identity isn't really about discovering yourself, it's about a role you're given. The idea is that humanity was created to be God's representatives here on earth, to reflect God's own character, and to manage the world according to a divine plan. That's presented as the number one definition of what it even means to be human.
And from that one core idea, the text builds out this logic, step by step. So first, you have humanity created in God's image. Right away, that identity is expressed through this complementary pair, male and female. Then, this pair is given a job, a commission, to be fruitful and multiply, basically to extend humanity across the whole planet. And finally, marriage is set up as the specific, promise-based context where that whole commission is supposed to happen. This entire sequence is what forms the blueprint for human relationships.
Of course, as you probably know, the story doesn't just stay in that state of perfect design. The second act of this biblical narrative is all about a major fracture in that original blueprint. It's a story of rebellion.
Now, from this viewpoint, you can't just look at specific ethical issues in a vacuum. Instead, they're presented as symptoms of a much bigger, much deeper problem. This fundamental break in the relationship between humanity and its creator. They're a consequence, you see, not the root cause. The idea is that the entire system has been thrown into disorder, and this is just one of the ways that disorder bubbles up to the surface.
So, if creation is the blueprint and rebellion is the fracture, how does that actually turn into a system of ethics? How do you get back on track? Well, that brings us to the idea of markers, rules and laws designed to guide people back toward that original design.
The laws in the Old Testament and the book of Leviticus are a perfect example of this. The command for the nation of Israel not to copy its neighbors wasn't just about, being culturally unique. It was deeply theological. These laws, including the ones about sexuality, were meant to be boundary markers. They were designed to visibly show that Israel's allegiance was to its creator, setting them apart from the surrounding cultures, which were seen as having drifted way off from that original blueprint. And you see this same kind of cascading consequence thinking pop up again in the New Testament, especially in the argument made by the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans. The logic flows kind of like this, like a set of dominoes. First, humanity swaps out worship of the Creator for worship of created things. That's idolatry. This swap then messes with human thinking. It distorts it. And that distorted thinking then plays out in disordered human relationships. Within this framework, same-sex behavior is presented as a theological indicator, a visible sign of that deeper internal swap.
But the narrative doesn't just end on that downer of fracture and disorder. The third and final act presented in the Bible is all about restoration. It's a path toward renewal that's offered through the message of the New Testament.
So the New Testament is framed as the direct answer to this story of rebellion. Jesus is presented as doubling down on that original Genesis blueprint for marriage. And the message of the gospel here isn't just about forgiving what went wrong in the past, it's about a total renewal, a fundamental reboot of human life. Believers are even called a new creation, and their ethics are meant to be this living, breathing expression of that restored identity, getting things back in line with the original design.
So really, it all comes back to this one thing. The core argument we've been walking through is that to truly understand the why behind any specific biblical rule on sexuality, you first have to get your head around this massive three-act story: creation, rebellion, and restoration. From this perspective, the rules are almost meaningless without that bigger narrative context.
And that leaves us with a final thought, one that goes way beyond this specific topic. This whole approach raises a much broader question for all of us, really. How does taking the time to understand a text's own internal story, its big picture, change how we end up interpreting all its individual pieces, its rules, its statements, its commands? It's a question about the very nature of understanding itself.